Today we're going to take a look at the French and Indian War, which is probably the most important of the colonial wars, as it started in the colonies and actually carried over into Europe, whereas the three wars that came before it started into Europe and came over into the colonies. And this is where George Washington in this French and Indian War makes a name for himself as a war hero. What's important to look at is that the French had settled very differently. They mainly went inland with the rivers and such, as they were fur trappers and kind of had to move where the animals that they were trapping were going. And they also moved depending on what Native American allies they had in the fur trade. So very different from where the colonists settled in the east. If you look also at the French fur trade, you can see here they did the fur trade that has much smaller population than the British did. They built forts rather than villages or communities. They did have good relations with the Native Americans, as they had to, because they needed them as allies in this fur trade. So their settlement, again, was very different from the British. Great Britain and France have a long history of rivalry between the two countries, and these are the three prior wars before the French and Indian War. The War of the League of Augsburg, War of Spanish Succession, War of Austrian Succession, all had to do with who was on the throne in Europe and had little consequence in the colonies. Instead, the French and Indian War is where we're going to see this big kind of spark, where the French built Fort Duquesne in the Ohio River Valley, which is where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers join. The Virginia claimed that same land. George Washington was sent out as a surveyor, but also to kind of scare out the French, and he built Fort Necessity, but the French forced him to surrender, and war broke out. One of the most notable things during the French and Indian War was a proposed union that was introduced by Benjamin Franklin called the Albany Plan of Union. They really wanted to strengthen ties with the Native Americans. You'll notice the Iroquois in their real name, Haudenosaunee, and also unify the colonies within. I'm a little sad my picture's not showing here, but it was a picture that Ben Franklin drew, which I'll show you in class, the Join or Die cartoon, which it shows a snake cut into segments. And basically it says that if the colonies don't join together, it's going to be certain death for the colonies. In the end, the legislatures did reject the Albany Plan of Union. The war did go very poorly for the British, especially early on. The Native Americans and the French used ambush tactics and things like that, which surprised the British. And so it took them some time to adjust to this kind of style, and leading to the death, really, of General Braddock, who was the leader of the English. And you can see this very famous picture here of General Braddock dying at the Battle of the Monongahela. This kind of leaves the British at a loss as to where to take the war next. They're losing. It's becoming unpopular. It's especially in England, where they're looking at it as something for the colonists. And so they have to kind of make a change. And the war has already broadened into a bigger war in Europe. And William Pitt is credited with turning the tide of war. You can see that in quotes there. He becomes prime minister, and he really throws everything he has into this colonial portion of the war. And so the British are able to overthrow, really, the French forces there. They obtain certain victory at once Quebec falls. Both sides suffer heavy losses, but at the end of the day, the British were able to win, and this would lead to the British victory in the war overall. And this war then has consequences for the colonies. The Treaty of Paris of 1763. Please make note of that. It's 1763. The British claim all of Canada. They get all of America east of the Mississippi River. Also get Florida in exchange for Cuba from Spain. Spanish had entered in the 7 Years' War. And Spain got all of the land west of the Mississippi River and New Orleans. And you can kind of see that on the map here. New Orleans will be important later on, as we need that as a kind of trading route into the Atlantic. But for the most part, this means the French are gone. The French have no power left in North America, and that only leaves the British, really. And then in Spain to the south and west, but for the British purposes. only the British are left to deal with the colonists. The Native Americans are kind of resentful of this, as they had been able to capitalize on this rivalry between the French and the British. They played one off of the other to benefit themselves. Well, now that the British are the only ones there, they know they're losing this, and the colonists are moving into more and more territory. And so the British pass what is called the Proclamation of 1763, which says that settlers can't move west of the Appalachians to try to appease or make the Native Americans happy. And it won't happen. The British can't enforce that unless they patrol the Appalachians, which they're not going to do. This will then lead to a host of other problems with the Native Americans. One of the other slides talked about them using smallpox against the Native Americans as kind of this biological warfare. The British-American relationships are strained. The British felt that the colonists didn't do enough. The Americans couldn't believe that the British actually lost as many as they did. Most importantly, this is the end of salutary neglect.